Election day is less than 2 weeks away, and the polls are all over the place. We're going to talk to a pollster about the state of the race and why the numbers seem so unpredictable. Then our political panel joins us, and we'll take a look at the electoral map, who's up, who's down, and who's leading in the pivotal swing states. And one guy who's up, this guy, President Obama, his approval ratings are soaring. Why is he enjoying such a surge so late in his second term? Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman, in tonight for Richard French, and we begin where else but with the race for the White House. And don't worry, folks, this will all be over soon. We're now just 12 days away from Election Day. And where does the race stand 12 days out? Well, it's tightening, or it's staying the same, or Clinton is expanding her lead, depending on what site and what source you're looking at. The latest big polls show a somewhat tighter race. Clinton up 1 according to the Republican-leading Rasmussen poll. The lead is 5 in an Economist poll and 3 in a Fox News poll, though poll averages have Clinton's lead expanding to 5.8, and Clinton remains between an 84 and a 92% favorite in polling forecasts and on the betting markets. Confused? So are we, and we look at polls and election information for a living. So let's just look at the polls from just this week, and you'll see how confusing this gets. All of these polls, all from this week, show Clinton with a lead, so there's that. Most of those polls are in the 4 to 6 point range of a lead for Hillary Clinton, but other polls show Clinton up just 1 or 2, and others have her up 9 or 14 points. And again, can't stress this enough, all of these polls are just from this week. And on state polls, some forecasters made news today, shifting Florida, Nevada, and Pennsylvania and calling them toss-up states, while others have them all leaning towards Clinton. So to try to make some sense of where the race really is and what we should look for and avoid as we check polls, I spoke earlier to Don Levy. He's the director of the Siena College poll. So Don, let's start with the big question. Is this race actually tightening, or has the race always been about a 5 to 7 point Clinton lead, and we're just starting to see that a little better reflected in the polling?
Well, at this point, our polling reflects that the race does not seem to be tightening in the last couple of states that we've looked at. In North Carolina, for example, that we just polled last week, we saw the race spreading rather than tightening. We have right now Clinton up by 7 points in North Carolina. About a month ago, we had that race dead even. We just took a look at Pennsylvania. There we also see Clinton with a 7-point lead, and that has been holding pretty solid now over the last month. And most recently, when we polled in New York, we saw Clinton continuing to hold more than a 20-point lead over Trump. So while some of the polls of some of my colleagues show a mild tightening, our polling does not reflect that. We continue to see in the battleground states in which we've been polling, Clinton in many cases with a very strong, not quite insurmountable, but strong lead.
So you've got consistency or slight expansions going in your polls. Why do we see so much variance in so many different polls? Why are so many pollsters reporting different results?
Well, there are an awful lot of polls out there. Not everyone does polling in the same manner. Certainly, a consumer ought to take a look at polling averages, because clearly there can be some outliers, because not everyone uses the same sampling technique. Not everyone does the same type of weighting. Some people will make assumptions about what the electorate is going to look like on Election Day. All those factors can feed into polls being somewhat different. So really, the astute consumer ought to either look at the poll they trust, and of course I'd suggest Siena, but other than that, the intelligent consumer is going to take a look at an average of a number of polls. I'd look at live interview polls more than IVR polls. Those are the ones that are conducted by a computer. Also, I'd look at the sampling methodology that people use. There are some polls, the USC LA Times poll, for example, that uses a panel asking the same people over and over questions. I'd stay away from that and go with live interview polls.
Should we expect polls from different pollsters to start to look very similar to each other as we get closer to Election Day, or will they continue to be different?
Well, there's going to be some polls that could potentially suffer from a little bit of groupthink, people looking over their shoulder to see whether they are the same as other folks. But really, my advice would continue to be to look at an average of the polls. There can be noise. There can be some disagreement in terms of the construction of the sample. Again, what you want to do is take a look at the average of a number of polls, and that's readily available on many websites. You can take a look at that.
How accurate has polling been in this cycle? We've heard some people who said, like the Brexit vote in Great Britain, nobody seemed to see that coming, but Others have said the polling did reflect that, and as it did during the primaries. Any way to know how accurate polls are this year?
Well, we won't know exactly how accurate our poll is until Election Day. I mean, that's the great test in the work that we do. Do we call it accurately when the votes are actually cast? You know, and everybody, I think the best thing is to be transparent with your methods. If you take a look at some of the work that we're doing, we're very happy to tell you exactly how we do it, exactly how we determine who's a likely voter. What we're seeing in this cycle, of course, is in some states, many people, as much as 20, in Florida, for example, right now, we're at 23% of folks have already voted. So we're including those people in our polls. But, you know, the great test is going to take place on Election Day. There have been tremendous victories that public opinion polling have had, but there's also been a couple of clunkers. And in some cases, Brexit was one of those clunkers. We certainly at Siena, we didn't poll Brexit, but I have sympathy for the folks who polled it and did get that one incorrect.
Don, a lot of Trump supporters have looked at some polls and said, well, this doesn't really accurately describe or reflect all Trump voters because they might not have voted, they might not be considered likely voters. Does your poll and have other polls accurately, to your mind, accounted for those less frequent voters who might be in this race?
Well, certainly we do. What we do is we take a look at people's voting history and we compute a probability that they're going to turn out to the polls. But we don't exclude people who have not voted in the last 4 or even 8 elections. We call them up and we both have a computation of what their history indicates they will do, but we also ask them whether they will or will not vote. And certainly if someone says, I'm absolutely going to turn out and vote, yet we know the records indicate that they haven't voted, we still consider them a likely voter and they're included. You know, I think that, you know, bashing the pollster is a technique that many of the campaigns have been involved in. And, you know, it probably is good for motivating their base, for keeping the interest, especially when a candidate may very well be down. But every single good and reputable pollster is working as hard as we can to make sure that we'll have a representative sample, that each and every voter has an equal chance of being in. We're calling people on cell phones. We're calling people on landlines. We're especially feeding newly registered voters or voters who have not voted frequently into our sample to make sure that we don't miss that voter who, for one reason or another, is motivated this time and hadn't been in the past. At the same time, we've had voters that have voted in every election for the past 8 cycles who, you know, gets on the phone with us and says, you know what, I don't like either of these candidates. I'm not going to vote. And they're part of the equation right now as well.
Don Levy, Siena College poll director, thank you for a few minutes at a time when we need you the most.
Pleasure to be with you.
Well, the polls matter, but the map matters even more. Our panel will join us after the break to look at the scoreboard and who has more states in their column up on the board.